so I can advance the thing. My name is Mary Ruffin. I traveled here yesterday from Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live. And as I said to the folks at the Preservation Commission, I'm very glad to exchange the humidity for just the dry heat here. It's a little hotter, but doesn't feel like it without the humidity. So it's been a lovely trip, and spent some time today looking around. A little background: the Land Trust issued a request for proposals to hire someone to do a study of national preservation tools. And I was hired, and I was thrilled, because it just sounded like a really interesting, exciting project. And then after I was thrilled, I was kind of terrified, because preservation tools can be a lot of things to a lot of people, and it just kind of boggled the mind, not only the breadth of tools, but how to put that into a narrative that wasn't just sort of a word salad. How to give it some structure and form, so that whoever read the study, it would make some narrative sense, because there's just so much you could put in there. So what we've done is turned in an initial report that is structured, have some background, and then a discussion of tools. So the draft report's been turned in. I'm speaking tonight. Hope to have some additional conversations, and then a revised report. And the first part of the report really talks about governmental infrastructure that's already in place. A lot of the federal legislation, like the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the National Transportation Act, which has a Section 4F that deals with impact of transportation projects on historic resources, the Antiquities Act, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, all sorts of laws and programs that are already on the books. These are not new tools, but I wanted to include them in the report, because if you're not as aware of them, you may not realize that these are things that are, I guess, tools already in your toolbox that you may or may not be using. So that is in the report, which ultimately will be made available and to be read. But I didn't want to spend a lot of time on that, because I feel like those are tools that you already have, whether you use them or not. What I wanted to do was talk about tools that you might not have, or not have all over the state, to see which would be best. And so one of the things I wanted to do is let you all be, to some extent, some initial guinea pigs. They're going to be on a statistical sample of the entire state of Wyoming. But as we go through this and talk about different types of tools, it's a two-sided handout that talks about tools. One side asks you to circle those that you think would be good types of tools that people would use and that would fit in Wyoming, and the other side asks you the ones that would not fit. And hopefully through that, as it's around, to kind of see if there is any consensus about some of the tools that seem to be a better fit in some. Now, the idea being that all of those tools discussed in this initial draft, sort of on a, I don't want to say superficial, it's a little more than superficial, but not completely in depth. But if we get some interest in specific types of tools, those are the ones I'm going to go back and maybe do some case studies or some additional research information, and sort of those would be the ones that would be highlighted and kind of bulked up in the report, because they're the ones that seem that they're the most relevant and the best fit. So I've broken out the types of tools into 4. We're going to talk about those that deal with preservation methodology, and then we're going to take a little break, because I will talk for a long time at that point. And then talk about organizational tools, outreach and educational tools, and financial tools. So if you're looking at your handout, that pretty much follows the format that I'm going to be taking. So I had a great boss. One of my first real jobs in preservation, I worked for an archaeologist who said all of historic preservation can be distilled into 3 words. It's identify, evaluate, and treat. And I was right out of grad school and I thought there's no way, but the longer I have been in the field, the more I realize it's absolutely correct. But that is really the essence of what we do in preservation. We identify, we see what's out there, we evaluate to see what's important, and then we decide what to do with it. So in terms of methodology and tools, I decided I would organize it along those. So identification in a lot of cases is what we call traditional architectural or archaeological survey. You go out and you do field work. If you're responsible, you wear a neon vest, so you don't get hit by somebody, and people know that you're not just skulking around their neighborhood, that you're actually quasi-official. But you go out, you take pictures. If you're an archaeologist, you do shovel tests to see what you can find. You take photographs. You may map it. You may tie it into a GIS system. You may do a written description of what you've seen and what you found, and it ends up in a collection somewhere, a lot of times at the State Historic Preservation Office. There are federal agencies are required to do survey under Section 10 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So any agency that owns property or has control of property, hypothetically, is supposed to be surveying anything that's over 50 years old, which are things that are potentially historic. So looks like all of us might in this room most of us could be potentially historic. The State Historic Preservation Office also generally does surveys throughout the state in different communities. Local governments, often in coordination with SHPO, certified local governments, and do surveys to see what properties or what resources exist. Map them, understand them, figure out the date of them, maybe the architectural style, what have you. And sometimes private property owners will do some sort of survey. What do I have of the large extent of land? What are the resources on my physical property? So, mapping, writing, photographing, just knowing what is out there. I think in terms of identification, there's some important questions that are asked from time to time and should always be in the front of our mind is, what are we surveying? If it's a community that's raising money to survey a neighborhood, what neighborhood are they surveying? What neighborhoods are they not surveying? Being aware of where your attention and your focus is and where your resources are being directed. Who is doing the surveying? What are their qualifications? Which is not to say that you have to have a PhD to do this kind of work, but do you know what you're looking at? And I say that not only for academic, but also culturally. There's a great article that I had to read in grad school. Of course, the title just went out of my head, but it was about someone who was doing a resource survey in a small town in North Carolina called Mania. It's on the Outer Banks. And there's this surface parking lot. And if you came and surveyed during the week, you wouldn't look at it. But if you came on a weekend, you realize that Friday night, that's for everybody who, it's a small town, there's not much to do. That's everybody parks and cruises and, meets their girlfriend and hangs out. And it's a surface parking lot, but it's got great cultural significance for generations. This is where high school kids hang out on a Saturday night. Surface parking lot, but it's still culturally an important place. So if you don't come on the right day, and if you're not from Mania, it's just a gravel lot. But it's actually something that should be surveyed in some contexts. So when you talk about who's doing the survey, how well do they know the community or the types of resources they're looking at, in addition to, I don't know, having a degree and being able to know the verbiage for certain types of architectural styles, but also a cultural context. And then where is the data stored? Who owns that data? Once you've done a survey, particularly if it's not just your own property, but looking out the community, does the neighborhood that you survey have access to that material? Should they? In cases of archaeological survey, a lot of times you don't want to make that public because you're worried about people who might come and commit vandalism or loot archaeological sites. So thinking about where that information lives and who should have access, or in conversely, who shouldn't have access and for what reasons. So it's important to think about those things as you start doing that kind of work. I wanted to give an example in that of something a little different than your traditional architectural survey for those of you who work in the field. This is the Saving Places Index that was done by Historic Macon Foundation. It was based on a process developed by the Trust for Public Land called a green print. And they had seen a neighboring county do this green print as opposed to a blue print because it was a land trust. And so they decided they were going to adapt something for Macon-Bibb County. It's a consolidated government now. It's, city county is one government. It's Macon-Bibb. And so they did a Saving Places Index. And so they worked with Trust for Public Land that has a great GIS mapping capacity, just fantastic resources there. And they looked at 3 different categories of resources: historic, recreational, and conservation. Conservation broadly, not only in terms of sort of farmland, but also wildlife habitat. And they looked for places that were multivalent, places where if you laid a map and you sort of highlighted all the cultural and then all of the recreational and the conservation, places where more than one value overlapped. The idea being that they wanted to be strategic about their advocacy and their investment in terms of places in Macon-Bibb that ought to be saved. So if it was something that scored in more than one of those categories, then that was some place that they wanted to look carefully as to a place that they might want to be involved in protecting or preserving. They did a lot of work with pulling in data that was already out there. So survey data that the State Historic Preservation Office had, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources had all sorts of maps of different types of habitat. There's a bird I know about now called a painted bunting that looks like a bird that has been dropped into a paint, 3 or 4 or 5 different paint colors. It's the most, look it up, Google painted bunting. And I found out that there's great painted bunting habitats. For the whole time I worked on this project, then I kept looking for painted bunting. I still yet to find it. It's now on my life list. They took information, they took Sanborn insurance maps, which were insurance maps from the turn of the 20th century. That showed where historic buildings were at that point that they could then geo-reference and sort of put as a layer on this map. They also had access to maps done in the 20s and 30s that had to do with federal lending, the concept of redlining, where neighborhoods with red lines around them, which were traditionally poor and African-American, were not given loans. And so by having all of those different layers, they could start to see patterns in terms of where places were, where they weren't, whether there was a correlation between heat mapping and tree cover and red line maps, whether there was just all sorts of ways that you could slice and dice that data. So it's a little more sophisticated than your typical architectural survey, but in terms of preservation tools, being able to pull data from a lot of different areas. And I think particularly for an organization like the Sheridan Land Trust, which doesn't just look at environmental issues or farmland issues, but also looks at preservation, to be able to map those and then combine them to look, I think is a really good example. In the Commonwealth of Virginia also, which does a lot of work at the state level, state government with easements, has done a similar sort of project because they wanted to make sure that their investments were targeted, that they were getting most bang for their buck. If they were going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a conservation easement, if they could find one that was not just because someone offered it for sale, but because it's actually within an area that was targeted, it would be a better use of taxpayer dollars. So that's just an example of identification that goes above and beyond your typical preservation to being able to look at multiple different values at the same time. Again, which is, I think relevant for an organization like the Land Trust that hired me, which is a kind of a holistic land trust that looks at a lot of different values. Evaluation is, again, what's the difference between, particularly from a building context, something that's old and what's historic. You know, what is farmland versus what is maybe prime farmland with really good soils. That's you know, more important if you're gonna put an industrial park on a farm, which is the one that's got the best soils or some other, you can tell I'm not a farm person, some other value that is hard to recreate. You know, how do you make sure that you are managing that growth and development in a smart way and protecting the more important for the rarer or more valuable types of agricultural or environmental habitat protection. In terms of preservation, the State Historic Preservation Office here does a really good job with writing historic contexts, which are, you know, long narratives that look at a certain theme that gives you context. That's why it's called context for evaluating properties that fall under that theme. So this one has to do with Pony Express, Mormon Pioneer, and historic trails in Wyoming. So if you're looking at resources along a trail, you can see, you know, what is the story of that trail? How does this resource fit within a larger story? You know, is it particularly rare? Is it particularly significant? Is it, you know, one of, you know, only two left, or there are a million of them, and this is really not the best of them in terms of how it looks. So those contexts, Wyoming has done a good job. Not every state has these kind of published contexts. So that's someplace where Wyoming may be a step ahead of some other jurisdictions and some other state offices. And I was really happy to see that. You know, designation, which is word under context, is technically a treatment, but context is how you decide what is important. And there are federal designations, there's state, local designation, and there's also in Wyoming sort of a state designation. And again, there may be people in here who've forgotten more than I know about the state's designation, but I will talk about that in a few minutes. So just a review, some of you may know this. On the federal level, there's National Historic Landmarks, and then there's the National Register of Historic Places. There are some subtle differences, but probably the most important difference is National Historic Landmarks are things that are nationally significant. You don't have to be nationally significant to be on the National Register, which kind of throws people off. You can be statewide significant, or locally significant, or regionally significant, not necessarily of national significance. And so I did not pick, because this is supposed to be statewide, what's important for Wyoming, not do Sheridan examples, but I did do Wyoming. The Ames Monument, which now I really want to go see it, because what is amazing to me as somebody from the East Coast is that's by H.H. Richardson, and it's related to the Ames. It has to do with the Transcontinental Railroad, but H.H. Richardson and all sorts of incredible houses in Boston for the Ames family. The Ames Gatehouse still exists. And so when I think of H.H. Richardson and the Ames family, I think of Boston. And to think that they're both represented in Wyoming was a revelation to me. And so now I won't make it on this trip, but it's now on my bucket list. That's something that's nationally significant for its association with the railroads. Or you could have something on the National Register, and I wrote down the name of the school so I wouldn't forget it, although I forgot and I had to look it up again, and I realized that it is not the only school that looks like this in Wyoming. It was a staggered plan because it's not the Danville School, it is the Lower Shell School. A one-room schoolhouse that can be partitioned internally to serve more than one class, but really the wonderful stone that you see here, that's, you know, you guys probably don't think twice, and I've been sitting here looking at all the stone buildings and drooling all day because it's such beautiful stone and not something I have where I'm from. So I just love it. This one apparently has been repurposed as a house, which is cool. So that's something that's on the National Register. Locally, there's the option to designate things locally and have design review. It's not universal in Wyoming, but it is something that can be opted into. And then for state, you know, because some states will have a state register of historic places. The only thing I could find in Wyoming that is anything like a state designation is the rare and uncommon area that is under the Wyoming Environmental Quality Act. And it has to do with mining permits. And if the Wyoming Council for Environmental Quality finds something that is a rare and uncommon area, it can have an impact on your ability to get a mining permit. So it's not for any other kind of state action, it's just mining permit, it's not roads or transportation. And it was not clear to me, maybe more digging would understand it better, what constitutes rare and uncommon when the standards are pretty clear. And it's the Environmental Quality Council that designates that. I'm not sure if they're required to have people with certain types of backgrounds or qualifications to make that designation. It's not necessarily tied in with the State Historic Preservation Office, but there is technically at least one type of statewide designation that can be tied to archaeology and architecture and historic values in the state in this very, very limited context. So, in terms of evaluation, like survey, just some questions to think about. What guidelines are used? National Historic Landmarks and the National Register have very specific guidelines. They generally have to do with significance and integrity, which is a word that I hate, but it is the word used in the field, because when you say a property doesn't have integrity, it's like it's dishonest or a morally bad building. I hate that word, but it basically has to do with the property's ability to communicate its historic appearance. Is it in the same location? Does it have the same setting? Does it have the same materials? They covered it with vinyl siding, and they put an addition on it that's so big that you can't even figure out where the original one was. Is it, how much of it is really there? It's sort of like the story of, I inherited my grandfather's axe. I'm so glad to have it, replaced the handle twice, the axe had 3 times, but I'm so glad to have my grandfather's axe. It's not really his axe anymore. We replace the handle and the head. But that's the idea of integrity. Is it really what was there when it was built, when it happened, when it was significant? So those are the guidelines pretty generally for the National Register, but other types of designations can have other guidelines and rules for designation. I think most people stick with the register because it's been out there for such a long time and has been vetted, and there's such a sort of a field of history of what happens if this happens. There's this sort of, I guess if you're a lawyer, it'd be like there's case law out there about it. There's an understanding, there's a lot of precedent, but it doesn't mean that you need to be bound to it. I think it's important to look at what history is examined and what history is not. I think the historic preservation field has worked very hard, particularly in the past 5-10 years, to look critically at itself about what sort of history they're looking at, maybe what history is neglected and ought to be looked at as well. How do we understand again that physical integrity, and do there need to be different standards for different types of buildings, for different cultures that maybe have a different appreciation and understanding of building and building typology? I use an example this morning when I was talking to the Preservation Commission. I was trying to get an African American church on the National Register, the Annie Zion Church, that was originally a frame, wooden frame building, and that was dating to like 1901, 1902, and then in the 1950s they covered it with brick. We say it doesn't have much integrity because granted, the bricks are 50 years, that's one thing, but there is a tradition in the American South for Black churches, many of which, when they started, did not have a lot of money to build wood because wood was cheaper, and then brick it over when they had the money. It was a sign of status. It was a sign of the church and the church members being wealthy enough to build on brick, and that should not count against them, because that was actually a part of a widespread tradition in the African American community as far as some churches. That was not robbing of its integrity. It was actually part of the building tradition. So, understanding the culture that you're dealing with and the traditions and how that might impact how you look at integrity or significance. And again, how do we engage populations to identify, again, that unobvious significance, like the surface parking lot meeting? What are the things that you don't see because maybe that's not where you're from, maybe that's not your culture. And if you had somebody there, you say, no, actually what you're looking at is this. And then all of a sudden you see it, and you see it everywhere you go because you've been educated as to what to look for. If that population wants to share with you, which they might not. And that's legitimate as well. They may not want you to know why something's important, they may want you to get out of their neighborhood. And you know, I've dealt with that as well, and you need to say thank you very much. And now I want to talk a little bit about different types of treatment. You've looked out in the landscape, you've found the resources that are important, you've mapped them, you've documented, you've kind of evaluated to see which ones, which ones are important to you based on the value system you've set up, and which ones are maybe less important. Which are your priorities and why? And then how do you treat those things? And I broke it up into a couple. The first one is legislative and public policy type of treatments. So local ordinances, zoning, smart growth, environmental review are some examples that I want to share with you. Local ordinances, when most people think about local ordinances, they think about historic districts for buildings, where you might have to get permission from the Historic Preservation Commission to change your building through a certificate of appropriateness process or something like that. That's a pretty widespread phenomenon throughout the country. But there are other types of local ordinances. One that is not as common is local archaeological ordinances. There are a couple of places that do that. The ones that I know most about are Alexandria, Virginia, and St. Augustine, Florida, where they actually have city archaeologist on staff. And they have areas in the city, or in the case of Alexandria, the whole city is an archaeologically potential zone. And if someone wants to develop, which involves ground disturbance, they need to take their plans to the archaeologist, who will look at what they know about the development of the city and say, yeah, I think this is an area where there is a lot of archaeological potential and we need to go carefully. Or they can say, unless you find something while you're out there, and you are honor bound to tell me, I think you're probably pretty clear. There was a big building here, 50 years ago. When they demolished it, they excavated, and pretty much that ground's already been disturbed a lot and deeply. I think you're probably fine. In this is a picture in St. Augustine. They actually have a crew of volunteers who've been trained who help with the documentation and recordation of sites. So they're looking at a trench and they're looking at all the different layers, the stratigraphy, and they're taking notes. A great opportunity for outreach as well. But these ordinances generally require developers to do initial archaeological testing, and if they find significant concentration, to do some sort of what we call salvage archaeology. So really quick, but let's get everything out of the ground, because you've already got a loan with your banker and the clock is ticking, your time's money. So the deal is you gotta wait another 30 days, but we're only gonna take 30 days. We're gonna get as much as we can out as quickly as we can, and we can keep this project going. There are also laws in most states about late discoveries, or what happens if you actually find human bones, which is a whole nother, that's not just archaeology, that's human remains, a whole nother set of rules, as we treat remains differently than we do other artifacts. Just FYI. Another type is demolition by neglect ordinance. And a lot of times you can see this phenomenon in places that had preservation ordinances. Somebody says, well, I don't like that preservation ordinance. I think it's going to cost me too much money to fix stuff the way, which may or may not, the way they want to. And I want to demolish it, but it's going to be really hard with their rules. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit here and leave all the windows open and leave this whole roof. And there's going to be so much water damage that then I'm going to say, oh, this is a threat to public safety. This is going to fall down and hit somebody and kill them. And I'll get my demolition permit because I've neglected it to the point that it is now structurally unsound, and I can get a demolition permit. So there are ordinances in communities where if there's a building that is historic or important or designated or whatever the trigger is in that community, where if you know that it's not being maintained, you can see there's holes in the roof that hadn't been fixed, the windows, you can require the person to secure the building envelope, and if they don't, the city can go in and do that and then charge it as a lien against the property to maintain it, so that they can't get around the anti-demolition permission prohibitions by neglect. It's called demolition by neglect ordinance. It's usually you know, and I don't know your town well enough, but you know, in a lot of times where they are, there's like one or two property owners who own a lot of property somewhere and they don't really maintain it, just kind of hold it because they want it. And they all know who it is. And, you know, it's just one way to make sure that that one person who for some reason seems to be a property hoarder at least maintains them so that they're safe. Another public policy is zoning. Surprise, Wyoming doesn't have mandatory zoning. We talk about biases, you know, coming from the East Coast. I thought, you know, the only place that didn't have zoning was Houston. So live and learn. It is a tool that works in some places. In some places, you know, when we talk about what fits, what doesn't, you know, that might be something you say, no, that's not fine. I mean, that's not, we don't do zoning. But for communities that do, in addition to your sort of traditional, this is a residential zone, this is a commercial zone, this is an industrial zone. They'll have something called an overlay zone, which is the split district zone. So it lays overlays, it lays over the underlying zoning, which might be residential and commercial, but has an extra layer of regulatory requirements in terms of how you can treat the properties there, whether or not you can demolish them, whether you can change them. And generally, they speak to a process, they speak to guidelines. And the guidelines are generally not incorporated into the zoning ordinance because you might want the guidelines to be flexible or changed in a process that's easier than changing the local ordinance. Usually the ordinance will say, and you know, the permission to change it will be guided by the, you know, by the town of Smith Mountains Historic Preservation Guidelines, which is a separate volume that's incorporated by reference, but not within the ordinance itself, which makes it much easier to, again, update those ordinance, those guidelines without having to go through the whole process of updating them. Smart growth. And I had a hard time finding a picture for this until I found this book, and then thought that looks like a great book, so I ordered it. So it's waiting for me at Amazon tomorrow. It's already at my house. Smart growth is sort of a grab bag term, but it basically is public policy at either the state, but usually at the state or the local level that is against sprawl. So how do you protect open space? How do you protect natural resources, air and water quality? And in doing that, how do you focus development in places that are already developed so that you maximize the infrastructure that's already been built? How do you sort of herd development into places where you already have water and sewer or paved roads so that that infrastructure continues to be used and utilized and amortized through development rather than having to stretch it out somewhere else? Maryland probably was among the leaders in smart growth at the state level. They have state legislation that requires certain types of comprehensive planning at the county level that includes goals about smart growth that need to be incorporated in every county's comprehensive. I've read a couple of comprehensive plans for other projects, and some counties are more gung ho about meeting those requirements, and some of them it's sort of superficial lip service to them, but they are absolutely by statute included in every comprehensive plan that set goals and how they want to do it. Again, you know, it's one of those things where I think most people would agree that those are smart things to do. They just don't like them until they have to. So maybe it's a question of, it's not that we think it's bad, we just don't want it legislated, but the idea of being able to concentrate the development in place, again, where you get the most out of the infrastructure you've already paid for, rather than extending the infrastructure into places where you're bringing development that will damage or potentially damage some of the other values and organs are worth thinking about. Another one is broad environmental review. And again, Wyoming's got a little bit of this again for mining permits, the Wyoming Environmental Quality Act, but it's extremely limited. If that's one end of the spectrum, the other end is the California Environmental Quality Act, which is incredible, which I don't think Wyoming would ever adopt. I don't think many states would adopt, but it is, if you want to talk about the Cadillac of environmental review at the state level, it would be California. Any state or local government action that could impact environmental quality or historic preservation has to be reviewed through a process that the whether it's a local government or a state agency has a process where they look at the undertaking, they look at what the impact's going to be, they look at their historic properties, they look at they're going to have an adverse impact, and then they look at ways to mitigate it. It's completely modeled after the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act at the federal level, but has brought it down so that it applies to the state of California, all of its agencies and its municipalities, which are children's. It is a lot of administrative work. It's a lot of paperwork. It means that projects take longer. But the state of California said these are our values, and we're going to have laws that reflect them and require that developers look at and try to mitigate adverse impacts on the places that we've all agreed to report. So I dated for years this guy who lived in San Francisco. We didn't get married. I thought we were. And so I was trying to get a job with Caltrans and really studying up on it. Was amazed. It was going to be a lot of work to figure out their system, but it was the first time I looked at that and realized just how pervasive that is. So, moving from legislation, public policy to legal, easements and covenants. These are tools that are used in this community. The classic analogy for owning property is that you own a bundle of sticks, and every stick is a property right. So one is the right to mine, one is the right to subdivide, one stick is the right to demolish a building. You know, each of your property rights is a bundle of sticks. As a matter of fact, if you Google bundle of sticks and look for an image to put your PowerPoint, every single picture of bundle of sticks comes from some law professor's property law seminar or things. Nobody, that's the only place we can find pictures of bundle of sticks on the internet is people talking about property rights, which I thought was funny. So when you put an easement on a property, you basically are taking the, I own this property, here's a bundle of sticks, and the right to subdivide it, I'm going to give it to the land trust. They own that stick, and it stays with them forever. So when I sell my property to you, you don't have that stick. You can't subdivide it because that stick has been permanently taken out of the money. So sorry. And you got to decide, when you look at it, it's like when you look at any other deed restriction or easement or anything else, when you're doing due diligence to see if that's what you want. If those things run in perpetuity, you run in the land, that's a permanent permanent transfer of those values. A covenant is like that, but it's less than a bundle of sticks. It's more like a contract where I say, from here on out, this property will never be used for X, Y, and Z. It's more of it's less of a transfer of a right and more of an agreement. And this is where I do my disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer, so this is my explanation of layman's terms. If you want a real legal definition, you have to ask a lawyer. Because they get really funny when you start talking about legal things, you're not a lawyer. And I want to talk about one good physical treatment, and that is mothballing. A lot of times you have to start property and think, oh my gosh, we got to do something with it right now. We got to get the money, we got to save it, we got to rehabilitate it, we got to put something in it. A lot of times that money or those uses may not be there yet for one reason or another. You don't have to have everything in hand to take care of the property. You don't have to have all the answers or all the money or all the buyers or all of the architectural solutions in hand. To be able to move forward, you can do what's called mothballing, which is basically securing the building envelope so you don't get a demolition by neglect letter. You secure the building envelope so that the roof and the windows are closed. You control for pests and make sure there are no termites or vermin or bats or birds. I don't know if any of you all know how toxic bird poop is in an attic. You can get antivirus and die. So you want to get all those animals out that can hurt the building, can hurt your health. provide for some ventilation, so if water does get in there, it can get out, protect it from vandalism and monitor it, and you let it sit there. I love this example because an architectural firm I worked with worked on this. This is called the Matthew Jones House. It's like an 18th century building in Virginia on land it's now owned by an army corps by Fort Eustis. You know, it's not part of the military mission. You know, Fort Eustis is spending the money on, you know, I don't know, guns and tanks and uniforms and army stuff. They're not really into preservation of some pre-existing building that has nothing to do with the army. It just happens to be on land that they own now. And so they mothballed it until there was a group of people who said, you know, we want to help you, we want to raise money to take care of it. So because the army had met their, you know, minimum requirements for, you know, surveying and protecting historic resources and mothballed it, eventually, when the volunteers had gotten together, when the money was there, when they found the right firm to do the work, they were able to rehabilitate it. So really, you know, if you let me geek out for a minute, one of the things that's really interesting about it, first of all, it's got these incredible T-shaped, great Virginia chimneys. But if you look, you see that line of glazed headers? That's where the roof was originally. And they built it up. So you can kind of see the evolution of the building over time and how it's expanded. It was what was called a hall parlor plan. And then on the other side, there's sort of an entrance vestibule so that they could control people coming into public and private spaces. For people who really want to write about 18th century Virginia architecture, it is this great building. So it's extremely important in that sense. And like it's right after 9/11, we got hard to get on base to see it. You can still get there, but you have to go through all sorts of security checks and we used to have to do to get there. But it's there and it's safe. And it's safe because they must follow it. They didn't have the time or the money, but they knew what they could do to sort of freeze it in amber and protect it until all of the things came together to take care of it. So I think a lot of times people think if they don't have everything, it's an all or nothing proposition. You can't save it now. You can't do everything right now. You shouldn't do anything. And I think it's always important to know that there's a third way that can buy yourself some time for some of these things. All right. The first part of the talk was very resource specific. So it was, you know, identifying, evaluating, and treating resources. And, you know, those are certainly preservation tools, but I want in the second half to kind of be a little more meta and think about things beyond the buildings or the archaeological sites or the landscapes, beyond the resources themselves, and think on a different plane. So I want to start with organizational tools, different types of organizations, and organizational tools that can be used in furtherance of preservation. And the first thing I want to talk about are heritage areas. And I'm going to read this because this is the definition. It's a place where a combination of natural, cultural, historical, and recreational resources have shaped a cohesive, nationally distinctive landscape. So there are what are called national heritage areas, and those are areas that are part of a system that is not run, but assisted by the federal government. We'll talk a little bit about the fact that you can be a heritage area and call yourself a heritage area without going through the federal process, but I'm a big fan of the federal process. So these are living landscapes. These are large areas where there is some sort of common theme or common story that can be told on the land. And because there is assistance from the Park Service, people immediately, the first, you know, fear is, oh my God, it's going to be another national park. The feds are going to buy this or take this. Feds don't want to do that. This is too big, and it's really not the function of a heritage area. However, if you are designated as a national heritage area, you can get assistance, technical assistance and funding for the management of the heritage area through the National Park Service. So I'll give you some examples in Pittsburgh, there is a heritage area called Rivers of Steel. And it is the story of the production of steel in Pennsylvania. So they look at the big blast furnaces that they use to make steel and preserving them and repurposing them and doing education. They look at the ethnic groups and the people who came to work in the steel mills and where they lived in and around Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's actually really small. They've got all these little townships around it that really everybody thinks of as Pittsburgh, but they're actually using them kind of the way that they don't have big counties like we got here. They have lots of little townships that are all put together. It's great in Pittsburgh. So they look at the neighborhoods where the people who lived and tell the stories of those people. The Erie Canal is a national heritage area that talks about the physical canal, but it also talks about transportation and commerce and how the canal opened up the Midwest into the trading ports of the East. It talks about, again, the builders. There were a lot of Irishmen who came to build some of these canals, some of the stonework and the locks. But it's also a great recreational trail. They've got a rail to trail where you can hike or ride your bike along the towpath, along this trail, along the canal. And it's fairly flat because, with the exception where the locks are, it's a fairly flat landscape because they have barges and they didn't want to go through rapids. So it's, if you're a biker, it's a pretty easy ride or a hiker. So there's a big recreational component to theirs. In coastal Georgia and South Carolina, there's the Gullah Geechee Natural Heritage Area that has to do with the descendants of slaves from a specific portion of West Africa who were brought there because they understood how to grow rice, which was the big commodity. It's tobacco in Virginia, but it was rice in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. And so they specifically, the plantation owners specifically looked for slaves from this certain part of Africa who all came there, have retained language, have retained foodways, have retained an incredible basket tradition. If you ever go to Charleston and you go downtown to the Four Corners of Law at the corner of King and Market and Street, you see the basket ladies, those are all Gullah Geechee people. And so that heritage area has less to do with buildings, although some buildings they look at it's looking at cultural ways in the landscape, the ability to get the sweetgrass for the baskets, the rice culture, the language, the religion. It's really pretty fascinating. I lived in Charleston for a while, and it's really, really interesting. So these heritage areas are incredibly disparate in terms of the types of resources, the types of landscapes that they cover. They're also very disparate in how they're run. So for Gullah Geechee, they've set up a nonprofit, which is the Gullah Geechee Corridor Commission. In the Mississippi Delta in Northwest Mississippi, where their heritage area follows the Delta, and it has some connection to agriculture, but it's really concentrated in blues music. It's run out of Mississippi State University. And so they've got within the university sort of a think tank department that helps run it. So any kind of group can be the management agency, the management vehicle to run it. And the priorities about how they want to use that funding, whether it is to improve the infrastructure for the bike trail along the Erie Canal, whether it's they want to teach basket weaving classes to younger generations, whether it's they want to restore the blast furnaces in Pittsburgh. The priorities are completely bottom up. They're driven from the region and the concerns of the people. And usually the management agency acts as a convener for private property owners, for historic sites, for any other organization that has an interest. So they have a management agency that helps work with all the groups that are interested in the aspects of that landscape that they want to preserve, protect, promote, interpret, brand, and works to help set goals internally that they want to meet. So in terms of tools, it's very, I was told I need to stay close to this. So sorry, people, I'm getting closer so you can hear me. In terms of a tool, it's extremely flexible, but it allows for a cooperation and coordination on a large regional basis around common themes and common interests. They have a lot of these heritage areas have started their own sort of consortium called the Alliance of National Heritage Areas. And if you want to look at studies about the economic impact of heritage areas or any other aspects of management, that's a good place to look. The movement for heritage areas really started before the Park Service had any kind of framework for it, and the Park Service has kind of had to play catch up. And how can we be relevant and how can we help you? So really, it's been very grassroots driven from the get-go, mainly because it started when the Park Service had a program for it. So the Park Service just, okay, well, we'll help. We can't get in front of this. We've already taken it and defined it. And I mentioned you don't have to work with Park Service. You don't have to be a nationally designated heritage area. Some states like Maryland has their own system of state heritage areas. But all of the heritage areas, whether they're official national heritage areas or not, tend to adopt that same sort of framework of let's look at it, let's define it, let's find the landscape, let's talk about the living landscape, let's talk about the themes and qualities that make it distinctive, and let's talk about the entities and the people and the resources within that landscape and about what we can do together that's greater than what we could do separately. So I'm a big fan. Land banks, which are somewhat different than land trusts. About 17 or 18 states have legislation that allows the creation of land banks. They are usually a nonprofit or a quasi-governmental agency that has sort of special magic powers when it comes to underutilized land. They can sometimes take land and clear titles. If there's a cloud on the title, it's sort of like once you come to the land bank and you come out the other side of the land bank, the land bank sells you, magically your title is cleared. In some cases, they are allowed to dispel liens. In some cases, land banks are given priority for properties that are being auctioned for taxes, unpaid taxes. But basically, it is a vehicle that's not meant to hold on to property, but to find these troubled parcels and make them able to go back into, productive use. So it is a temporary owner, a temporary user, but one, again, that has sort of magical powers to get rid of a lot of the problems that would make a piece of property unattractive to your typical private sector buyer. Liens, cloudy titles, things like that. Again, it's not technically a preservation tool, but land banks have, like in Atlanta, there's a land bank, and there was a significant property in a neighborhood, again, it was an heir property. So there had never been a will, and it has been several generations. So instead of one owner, there were like 20 descendant owners who lived all over the country. And so it was able to have capacity to help clear that title and then turn it over to a nonprofit who redeveloped. Resident curators, and this is from a magazine in Fairfax County. This concept started in state and local government, a lot of times parkland that had a historic property, and again, they didn't have a use for it, and maybe it was in bad shape. And so it's set up where the park or the state park has this, historic building on it. They don't have the money, and it's not part of their interpretive mission. They're not going to bring school kids to this building, but it's still a pretty great building, where they'll say, okay, we're going to sign a lease with someone, a long-term lease. You can live here for 15 years. You only pay $20 a year to live here, but you've got to do the rehab, either yourself or you've got to pay for it yourself. So basically, you get to live in this great house, usually in this wonderful landscape without anybody. It's not really as much of an issue. There's a lot of open space, but in the East Coast, where it's hard to find a place where you have a lot of open space and no neighbors. You live there cheaply, but you earn it through either your own sweat equity or through you're hiring people to fix up and maintain the property that may have some serious problems. So it's a quid pro quo. But again, it allows the government in this case, although it could be a nonprofit. I know of some nonprofits who own property who've done this, to continue to hold the property, but not be responsible for the cost of maintenance, and also have somebody in it so that it's not going to be vandalized, or, you know, there's somebody in there watching it, protecting it. You know, an abandoned property is an invitation for problems. So great program. Seen again a lot of times with state parks and county parks, but more often some large preservation nonprofits are starting to adopt this model as well, particularly if it's something that they thought they were going to sell and then they couldn't find a buyer. It's like, okay, well, we'll have a resident curator, and it's another interim use when you don't have a final use in mind. Land trust. I feel like you all probably know more about land trust than I do, but generally the movement started to protect environmentally sensitive land. The land trust movement is expanded to include all sorts of things. There are land trusts that save battlefield lands, there are land trusts that save farmland. The idea that the land is not necessarily owned, but sometimes by the land trust, but usually protected by a covenant or easement, which then runs with the land in perpetuity, and the land trust has responsibilities for maintaining and monitoring, and in some cases enforcing the easement if you get a subsequent landowner who either doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand what the restrictions are, to enforce them in cases where you have subsequent owners that don't know or don't care. So we love land trusts. Whole campus partnerships, don't know how relevant that might be. Look at large places. This is in Utah, this is Fort Douglas. Fort Douglas was closed during the base realignment closing procedures, I guess it's around in the 90s. Really great historic buildings. And you know, a lot of them, big campus, big Army base. Interim use was housing for the Winter Olympics, Salt Lake City. And now it is dormitory and other spaces for the University of Utah. Really creative use of buildings. You see this at places like the Presidio, it's in Francisco, in Fort Monroe, a lot of times Army bases or military bases, but it can be other things like college campuses, where they will set up a management entity to redevelop the entire campus, and to slowly but surely find uses and the capacity for the rehabilitation of the structures, so that they may not be an Army base anymore or a college campus, but when you go there, you know you're on it in a special place. And it's usually, again, because there's been some sort of management entity set up to look at the larger preservation issues before finding solutions for the individual buildings. Revolving funds, we're getting closer and closer to Wyoming. This is in Montana, in Lewiston, Montana. This is a project that the Montana Preservation Alliance worked on. A revolving fund is, and sometimes organizations don't like to call them a fund because it makes it sound like they have a lot of money, like an endowment fund, and it hurts in fundraising because they're like, why would we give you money? You have a fund. So some people call it a threat to properties program, but basically it allows an organization either to make loans to property owners that can then pay back and then get loaned to other property owners. That is less frequent than one where an organization will either buy an option on a property or buy it in fee simple and either secure it and find a new owner, or who will even rehabilitate it themselves and then find a new owner. And so they've bought the property, they've secured it or rehabilitated, then they've sold it. And when they sell it, the proceeds go back into the program to the next one. So the idea is their intention is not to hold a lot of real estate all over the place, but to make targeted investments to save important places. And then once they've saved them, take the proceeds and find the next project. Very often, very rarely will an organization make money on this. A lot of times they break even. Sometimes they lose a little money, and it is, it's considered in the industry very typical for these programs to have to be recapitalized every 10 to 20 years, because generally it's not a profit, but it's usually a nonprofit that's doing this, and they're not supposed to make a profit. That's not their goal. Their goal is to fulfill their mission, not to return value to the stockholders. And so because it's a mission-driven investment, they fundraise for the rest, and they spend it down, and they either fundraise for the next corpus to start on the next round of buildings, or they say, hey, we've had a revolving fund for 10 years, now we're going to do something else. This was a property that it's not now Montana Preservation Alliance anymore, it's now Preserve Montana. The back of the building, which you can't see, had a chimney that fell and pulled out part of the back wall. And it got to the point where it's like if somebody doesn't do something soon, it's, lose it. And so they were able to buy the town. The building had been condemned. They bought it from the town for the value of the back taxes, paid the back taxes, fixed the wall in the back. And at one point they thought they were going to go into partnership with the developer and own it for a period of time and get, the revenue stream. That didn't work out, and so they have sold it to a developer. But in the interim, they secured it and also fundraised for a structural analysis and a feasibility study by an architect, so that when developers came and looked at it, they're like, I don't know. They said, well, here, we know it's structurally sound because the structural engineer has done this report, which we paid for. And I know you don't know whether this is a really good investment, but we done a market study, and this is how many units residential units you can fit in here, according to the local building code. And it made the investment a little more predictable for the private sector, because they had gone in and used the nonprofit status to fundraise, to fund the studies, and to do some of the initial structural work to save it. So revolving funds are great programs that allow you to make targeted investments on buildings that you don't necessarily want to hold on to yourself, but that need someone to save them in the interim. All right, we're getting, I think, where this is the penultimate topic is outreach and education. Historic trades, and you talked about historic core as we got started. This is actually, I think, a historic core picture at Mount Rainier, maybe, if I'm correct. Historic building trades there is a big disconnect between the need for them and the amount of people who can actually do them. Preservation Maryland recently started something called the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is a national advocacy movement looking for ways to promote people who can do historic carpentry, historic plastering, repair of historic wooden or casement windows, people who have that level of skill and craftsmanship and expertise. There are very few educational programs that are accredited. There is one in Charleston, South Carolina, called the American College for the Building Arts that started after Hurricane Hugo, because all of a sudden, all of the peninsula of Charleston got nailed by this hurricane, and they didn't have enough people who could do work that they needed to restore these very special buildings. And so they started this program, which is now an accredited higher education. You can get a bachelor's degree in the building arts. There are other programs which are not four-year college programs. Some of them are community college, like a certificate level. And then there are other ones that are just not necessarily academic, but tradesman-like. So great opportunities to partner with things like AmeriCorps or HistoricCorps and to create a partnership where you can sponsor or you can work with them to bring that kind of specialized training to the resources, and also provide the participants in that kind of program the kind of training. The Campaign for Historic Trades is working with builder unions to start to develop apprenticeship programs in specific historic trades, so that that if you want to go into building and become a certified historic plasterer, that there is some sort of designation that means that translates to what you're worth in terms of union scale on projects. Unions are a mystery to me. I grew up in a right to work state. and really wasn't, didn't know that they existed. So I went out and worked to school, and we had clerical and technical work. And I had my English class in a union hall all my freshman year because my professor wouldn't cross the picket lines. So depending on where you are in the country, that sort of whole union certification is a more important thing than in other places. But it's very significant, particularly in the Northeast. Another one like it that I just really like is called the Veterans Curation Program. This is a public-private partnership for veterans who are coming out of the military and looking to get new job skills. In this case, it's a 5-month program, and it's for any veteran, but I think initially there was an emphasis on people coming back from Iraq. They learn how to catalog, clean, and document archaeological artifacts. So they also are learning digital photography. They're learning database management because these are put into a database, so they're learning how to use Access, and in some cases learning how to do website and web-based ability to document and stuff I don't understand about putting these things on the internet. So they're learning specific skills within the context of curating archaeological artifacts, which there's always a backlog that needs everywhere that needs to be cataloged and curated. So it's a wonderful partnership that works with the Veterans Administration. And there's a private vendor called New South that's a cultural resources management firm that provides a lot of the training and administration. It's in about 4 or 5 places in the country. But maybe they could expand to another one, or maybe you could make your own that models after this. But what I really like about this is it addresses a need, but it also, in terms of preservation, but it also addresses a need for veterans. And those are 2 sort of groups that you don't think necessarily have anything in common, but when you bring them together, the ability to promote it and fundraise around it grows exponentially, because you're not just talking about preservation, you're talking about people here about veterans, and it brings them together towards common goals. I really like this program a lot. Outreach to non-traditional audiences is another one, the archaeologists. There is a federal law enforcement education academy in Georgia that had a class on archaeological crimes. And there's a guy in Virginia, I talk about Virginia a lot because that's where I'm from, where I do a lot of my work. A guy with the Department of Criminal Justice Services who said, I'd like to do this in Virginia. And so he set up this class. Everybody who's in law enforcement, every sheriff's deputy, every state trooper, every cop has to get continuing education. And there's certain things that you have to study, like I guess ethics and gun safety and things like that. But you're allowed to have a couple of electives every year. And so he developed this whole class called Time Crime. And it was really popular because it was not boring, the same thing they have to study every year. It was kind of like it. And so he taught these law enforcement agents, first of all, some aspects of archaeology that most people don't think about. So most people, when they think about archaeology, they think about Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and getting the golden artifact, and it's all about the artifact. But what's equally important for understanding the historical record is the context. And of course, again, I know this is a Virginia example, but spare me, bear with me, I just love it. He told a story, and of course, a lot of these guys were Civil War like aficionados, so he had them right there. Tell them about this battle. And he says, they would get their guns and they would pack them down with their ramrods, and then they stick the ramrods in the ground, and then they shoot, and then they have to reload, and they stuff it with the ramrods, and in order to be able to get the ramrods and guns, and then they can stick them in the ground and shoot. Well, apparently, I guess this is the Confederates were shooting. The Union guys came over the earthworks and just charged them, and the Confederates freaked out, and they took off and they left their ramrods because they were in such a hurry. That's how you know where the forward line was in that battle of the Confederates. Now, if you just took all the ramrods and you sold them at a relic show, you might make some money, but you wouldn't know where they were. And where they were was more important than any of those ramrods individually, because that's how you know where the line of the battle is. So that was his great argument for context. Where you find the artifact, how it relates to other things physically, either, on 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, gives you more information about what happened in that place than the artifact itself. So all of a sudden, these policemen are like, oh, well, it's bad for people to steal artifacts, but it's even worse if they take them away and we don't know where they came from, because then we lost the context. They got it. So, and then another really great part about this class was he talked about, my son loves these cop shows where they do the psychological profile of the killer. The psychological profile of the pot hunter. And they talked about what type of people do this, psychological profile, and what are the clues to look for, in terms of, it had something to do with like what they would drive and where they would park and what kind of stuff they'd have in the car that they would need for this. So if you pulled somebody over and they had all this stuff in the back of their car, they'd be like, these are the same kind of things you would find if you're going out pot hunting. So maybe I'll ask them some more questions if I've stopped them for some other probable cause, legitimate reason. And they found that the number of arrests and convictions on archaeological crime in Virginia went way up after these classes were taught. And so I think it's just, you think about who cares about preservation, and again, it's sort of like the veterans. Here's where it can be important to law enforcement. And it was a really great partnership. Now, the guy who taught that class went on to the Modern Museum in Philadelphia, and no one else taught it. And so they stopped teaching it, which makes me really sad. But you all could start a time crime thing in Wyoming, where you develop a curriculum and teach law enforcement about what to look for pot hunters. I don't know. I just think it's one of my favorite programs ever. I sat in on one of those classes once because my boss was teaching and we had to go somewhere else. And he said, well, come sit in on the class. And I hung on every word. So I think it's important to think about, not just sort of the people with the great barns who want to restore them, but, who are other people who cross the path of preservation, and how can you engage them and get them to be part of the movement? And, all those guys, they were really into it. These places were like totally into it. They were starting to talk about Turner's post-Wem and, flint napping and, colonel wear. I mean, there were some of them really got into it and started to really learn about the kind of artifacts you find and became real, part of the archaeological community, which they wouldn't have done if they hadn't taken this continuing education class. So I could go on for that for hours, but I love it. Another one is most endangered lists. This is one from the Cultural Landscape Foundation. But a lot of organizations on an annual or semi-annual basis will have a most endangered. It's a great opportunity to do public outreach in terms of getting nominations for most endangered and reaching out to the public to engage with them about what they think is important and is endangered. It's a great way for the organization that is sponsoring it to get a good PR splash once a year, every other year when they announce it. They may go someplace and do a press event on site somewhere. It is a great way for an organization that has limited advocacy, resources to focus themselves, to say this year, this is what we're going to focus on. It's going to be our most endangered. We only have so much money and so much staff time. So this is how we're going to focus internally, how we advocate for certain types of resources. It doesn't mean you go out and buy them, but it may mean that you help fundraise, or you bring attention, or you start to bring together groups of people who are also interested, who can then act as a convener by having made this an issue and brought the public's attention to it. So very tried and true, but still effective. That's why people still do it. Targeted studies, and I talked about this a little bit when I talked about the Broadway building. See, doesn't it look nice when the architect takes all the plywood off in his rendering? Looks great. You want to live there, right? Sometimes it's important or smart to hire someone who can do a study about certain aspects of preservation that you don't have the expertise in-house to do. So for the Broadway building, they had an architect, a structural engineer come in and do a study to help, take some of the uncertainty out of the decision for a potential developer. In Macon, where they are doing rehabilitation of housing, they hired Zimmerman Folk, who are great housing people, who to do a market study to say, okay, the type of people who are moving to Macon generally are young couples 1 to 2 children, they want an open floor plan, they want blah, 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 blah. Basically, to use whatever magic and demographics that their firm has developed to understand the housing market, to say, this is the price point. If you can't rehab these houses and offer them with these amenities at these price point, you're gonna be stuck with them. This is what's gonna sell. This is how you can make what you're trying to do palatable and marketable. Another example is economic impact studies. I talked earlier about a guy named Don Ripken, who's an economist. He and other folks like Rutgers University can go into a community and measure the economic impact of preservation. So if you're trying to make an argument to your local elected officials that preservation is something important in your community, and they kind of think, oh, well, that's great. You're like the history nerds, you're like the genealogists, you know, thank you very much. They pat you on the head. If you can show the economic impact, and you have an economist do it, who knows the real math and multipliers and all of the language that the economic development people speak, then all of a sudden it's like, well, I really don't care about that building. You don't care about architecture. Sure, but if you can show me that rehabilitating is going to have a bigger economic impact on our community than ripping it down and building new, then maybe I am a preservationist. So it's important to be able to speak the language of the people that you're trying to convince. So sometimes it's helpful to get a special study. Lectures and workshops, great. You know, they can run the gamut. They can be about history, they can be about technical aspects, but they're wonderful. And it's so nice that, knock wood, we're getting over COVID and we haven't really gotten into the depths of monkeypox, and we can actually get together and be in rooms like this. I can't tell you how much I've missed talking to people. I mean, Zoom is great. I'm glad we had it, but you know, nobody nods on Zoom. You don't really get it. You can't hear them breathing. You can't sense where they're actually listening to you. So, I mean, I love this, and I think it's great. You know, the best conversations are always the parking lot right afterwards, and that doesn't happen in Zoom. You don't have those conversations. You don't have that kind of convening. So I'm a big fan of lectures and workshops and technology. And this was great because, you know, if I had not sent my presentation in advance, I had actually done it in the very last minute this afternoon. I posted in new pictures about the great app that you use to go on the Black Diamond tour, where you download the app and you can listen to it when you go to the Black Diamond tour. So that's going in the presentation next time I do it. But these are examples, not quite as sophisticated in Hayden, Maryland, having a QR code, which is sort of a JV version where you can look on it and go to a website, but maybe not as cool as the app. The other one, and this works here too. This looks like a Facebook ad for West Virginia Tourism, and it is. But in going to Hancock, Maryland, I drove through West Virginia and I stopped for lunch and I looked at my Facebook feed and there was this thing for West Virginia Tourism. I hadn't Googled anything, but it knew I was there through geofencing. I think that's what it's called. And it's the same thing with Sheridan. I got to my hotel last night and I got this ad on Facebook about going to the Sheridan local government website and signing up to get their announcements because they know I'm here, which is kind of cool and creepy at the same time. But you know, there are ways that you can use technology to not only reach an audience, but also give them access to more information that then you can give them on a marker, you know, particularly if you've got a small staff. If you can put it on an app, I mean, smartphones are ubiquitous, for good or ill. Use them for good. Use them as a tool for people to get more information about where you are and what you have and why it's important. And tomorrow, on my day off, because I did an extra day, I'm going to go to Black Mountain because I'm so excited about to see how this app works. I'm really excited because I don't have to ask someone to come with me and explain it to me. I don't have to burden the staff here. I can do it myself with probably imagining their pictures and narratives and all sorts of multimedia events that I can get in my car on my own speed. I'm one of these people that my husband hates going to historic sites with me because I've got ADD. I can whip through things. I'm like, okay, I see what I've seen. It's like, okay, I'm ready to go. My husband's like, and I'm being awesome. So the nice thing about an app like this is, you know, people can go at their own speed. They're not forced to be with the tour guide, you know, like the one who tells you, and Pee Wee's Big Adventure, that tells you everything before you can ask about the basement of the album, which is really all you want to know. So it's important. All right, we're getting into the short runs. Financial tools. tax credits and syndication. Wyoming doesn't have state income tax. So we can't talk about state tax, income tax credits, but we can talk about the federal credit, which is 20% of eligible rehab costs. Building needs to be historic. You need to spend a threshold amount of money, which is $5,000 for your adjusted basis, and building recovery is greater. And you need to rehabilitate to Secretariat and community standards. I'm imagining that the Hello New Market train station was done with tax credits. Your great little market in the brick train station where I had lunch today. I'd be very surprised if they didn't use tax credits for that. Does anybody know?
I'm not 100% sure.
I'm dollars to donuts. They use tax credits for that project.
I was recently told by the deputy shipos of that, not a whole lot of staff throughout Wyoming, very few people.
I wonder what that is. Do they not know about it? Do they just not like to work with the feds? Well, you know, can lead a horse to water. It's a 20% credit against your eligible rehab costs. So I'm not good at math. If you spent $100,000, you get a $20,000 credit. You have to carry that credit forward within 5 to 7 years, something like that. You have to maintain ownership for that period. But I mean, if the credit is more than your federal tax liability, you can carry it over. You can also syndicate it, which is technically not selling it. But let's say you're a church and you don't pay federal income taxes. You can create, no, let's not use a church because that's not creepy. Let's say you're a nonprofit. Then you could enter into a time limited partnership with a for-profit agency, and you would let them take the tax credits and they would give you equity in return. It's usually anywhere from 85 to 90% of equity. So if I got I don't know, $100,000 credit, they probably give me $90,000 of equity for $100,000 credit. You gotta be good bedfellows because you gotta be in that partnership for 5 years until you've got past the recapture amount. But it's a great way for nonprofits to get equity for rehabilitation work for historic buildings. Tax credits, every year the Park Service does a book like this that talks about the impact, about how much it's used in every state, how much money it's generated, how much private investment it spurs. It is a tried and true tool. So if you're not using it, and I hope, and if the only reason is you don't like working with feds, I hope you can get past that because it's really, 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 really incredible. In states where there is a state income tax or state credit, like in North Carolina, which is 25%, you can get a 45% credit against your taxes. So that's 45% of the rehab cost basically paid for. And then our legislature started one for historic textile mills, because North Carolina was full of textile mills. It was everything that they did in the late 19th and early 20th century until everything went offshore because of low labor costs and tariffs. And so now all of these big hulking, huge buildings are empty. So they put in another credit for mills. So you almost are paid at that point between the federal and the state credit and the mills, and it costs almost nothing to rehabilitate those for active use. So again, some people will say, well, the state, not you all because you don't pay state, but the feds, they lose that tax revenue. That's horrible. Well, when you look at the economic impact of the rehabilitation of the building, it comes back. And in spades, the limited short-term loss of tax revenue is more than compensated by the long-term economic impact of the rehabilitation. Property tax increase because the building is now not empty but viable use. Payroll taxes for the construction jobs, which are part-time, and for the permanent jobs that are housed in the building. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that investment is paid back. So another one is property tax deferral. You all do pay local property tax. So this one is one that could be used. You probably need to get legislation. And again, this is a North Carolina example where I live. If you have a property that's designated a local landmark, property that, you have restrictions on what you can do with it because it's a local landmark, you can then take that landmark designation to the real estate assessor's office, and you're in a special class of properties where you are taxed at 50% of the building's basis. So basically, property tax get cut in half. Now, they call it a deferral, not a rebate, because hypothetically, if you did something to like rip the building down, they would go back and get 3 years of the taxes you didn't, like the last 3 years. So, you know, they would ask for that money back for at least, they'd reach back 3 years for it. So it's technically a deferral. But again, it's another way to provide incentive for someone to protect a building. They let you off the hook if like the house gets struck by lightning and burns down. They won't go after that. They won't try to recapture those 2 years of taxes if it's not your fault. But if you do something that causes it to lose its landmark status on purpose, they can come back for some of that deferral. But I'll tell you, again, in a place where I live, where the property values have gone crazy, more and more people want a landmark because for some of them, the inconvenience of having to deal with the restrictions on the property is worth it compared to what they'll save on the property taxes.
So that's a state.
It's state enabling legislation.
Okay.
That it's part of the part of the North Carolina code that deals with revenue that applies to the assessors
Okay.
in every jurisdiction.
I know a lot of places have both state mill levies and.
Oh, there you go.
No.
So but usually localities are children of the state, so it's still probably would have to be state legislation that now all localities do that. But yeah. Transfer of development rights, again, works in places where you have some sort of zoning and restriction. So I'll make this quick because there aren't very many of these, but it does allow, if you are in an area where you are allowed to develop, you can basically sell those development rights. There has to be a sending zone, so I'm the person who's sending my development rights to a receiving zone, and the receiving zone, a property owner who has property in the receiving zone can buy those development rights at a certain formula, and be able to build either greater density or maybe a taller building than they normally would under their zoning because they bought the rights from a landowner in a sending zone, who then permanently loses those development rights, and it's tied down with either an easement or a covenant. So in places where there are some sort of restrictions on development through zoning or some other land use law, you can set up to have a sending zone and a receiving zone. Sending zone would be a zone that you want to protect, and a receiving zone, not as much. But it monetizes, it provides a financial incentive for someone to limit the development potential of their property by sending their development rights to someone else who can then do more than they normally. All right, last slide, last slide. This is even more meta, and this has to do with dealing with foundations and other charitable givings. They're called program-related investments. If you have a foundation, you know, you have a corpus of money and you invest it, I guess, in the stock market, and you can give away 4% every year or whatever the formula is. So, you know, twice a year you get grant applications, you've got a budget, and you give it out, and then you let the corpus continue to spin off more money so that every year you can give grants, right? So mission related investment would be if I am a foundation that cares about healthcare, maybe all my stocks will be in healthcare stocks. And all my investing will be in stocks that give me money, but that, you know, give me a market rate return that are kind of more focused on what I do. Sometimes it's value investing, like people who don't, you know, environmentalists who really want to have a stock portfolio to meet certain criteria. Program related investing, which is, you know, not quite granted, is where a foundation will give money to a nonprofit that is doing something that they might normally give a grant to. But in this case, they can give more than what their grant restrictions are, because it's almost like a low interest loan. You know, you, historic preservation organization, are gonna rehab all these buildings, which is something we wanna do. We can give you a grant. We can only give $10,000 a year in grants. But we have this huge investment portfolio. If you can do this in a way that makes a little bit of money, and you can give us all the grant money back plus some very low interest. You know, we have gotten a little bit of money back, not as much as we get in the market per se. But we're not losing any money, we're making a little bit of money, and we're going to forward our shared mission. The 1772 Foundation, which is funding the study that I do, does some of this. The Knight Foundation, which was a foundation set up when Knight Ritter sold all of their newspapers, has foundations in cities where they had newspapers to do this. With organizations that have a track record, and you know, and that they know. Let's say instead of a small grant, we're going to give you a larger amount of money, the understanding that you have a building payment in a certain way, and you need to make, you know, interest payments. Again, it'll be less return to the foundation that they could get with a traditional stock portfolio, but they're getting the money back with a little bit of money and accomplishing mission at the same time. It's generally only done with nonprofits again that they have a good relationship with, they have a strong track record. It's something we need to start, you know, building that relationship. But philanthropy has really changed in the past 20 years and being very reactive. Like, I have a case in the foundation, and we will take grant applications once a year, we'll look at them, and we will see what comes through the door, and we will fund what's right. Really being more proactive and saying, what's going on in the community? How can we be involved? How can we shape the kind of, you know, how can we work with organizations that fall in our interest to make sure that they are doing as much as they can? How can we be a more active partner? And it's really kind of interesting to if you study philanthropy, to see that shift from being reactive to proactive, and program-related investments are a big part of that. Something to just keep in the back of your mind.
Let's